Hey, hi, hello. Okay, this is the new detectives Broken Vows.
Investigators find a clue they think will lead to a killer's front
Be
door,
back.
but instead find themselves heading down a blind alley. Now their most important evidence is withering before their eyes. When a man reports his wife missing, her abandoned car becomes the biggest clue, but it's the nosy neighbors who drive the investigation. 4 months into her marriage, Lily disappears. But when her body turns up, it's clear she was no runaway bride. Investigators must rely on flimsy evidence to bag her killer. For some lovers, marriage can be murder. Even though proving it may pose a challenge, killers can't divorce themselves from the consequences of their broken vows. In the early morning hours of December 28, 1995, Melinda and David McLean let themselves into the apartment of their sister-in-law, Becky Vargas. The telephone and electricity in her unit hadn't been switched on yet. Becky was separating from her husband and had just rented the Ogden, Utah apartment. Becky! She had told her husband, Stephen Vargas, she was going to try to start organizing her belongings and would return in an hour or two. But that was several hours ago. Stephen had asked Melinda and David to check on her, since they lived nearby. Melinda, who was Stephen's sister and Becky's best friend, was glad to go. Though they didn't see Becky, all seemed quiet and safe, leaving them unprepared for what they found. Becky Vargas lay dead in the leaves outside the building. Even before the sun was up, the Weber County, Utah crime scene investigation unit began its day processing the murder scene. The victim's blouse had been pulled up. At first glance, the condition of her clothes made her appear to be the victim of a random sexual homicide. But a closer look revealed the story was not so simple. Criminalist Russ Dean thought the scene might have been staged.
It was as if her body had been moved from one location to another. Her arm was under her body as if she'd been dragged. Her coat was removed and was under her body. The leaves were bunched up in certain locations around her arms and legs. And there was no other obvious indication of any type of sexual assault.
In fact, though the victim had suffered a head injury, most of the blood pooled at her feet, suggesting she'd been turned around. Whoever did this had apparently tried to throw off the investigators. The forensics team documented and collected a set of car keys, a cigarette lighter, fragments of blood-spattered leaves, and most significantly, the apparent murder weapon, a broken flashlight stained with blood and entangled with hair. They spent 6 hours sifting through every inch of the area before they were satisfied. They determined that although the body had been repositioned, the victim hadn't been moved far. The only blood found was just a few inches from where she lay. Because the blood-stained flashlight was the most compelling clue, it was analyzed first at the Utah State Crime Lab in Salt Lake City. Investigators could see that it had a partial fingerprint on it, stamped in blood. According to latent print examiner Scott Spute, a bloody fingerprint can be even better than a smoking gun.
When we have a bloody fingerprint, for example, it's the victim's blood. It's not her finger, it's someone else's finger on the evidence. It's a crucial pinpointing item of the evidence in which we can identify someone being at that crime scene, leaving that bloody fingerprint behind at the scene as they left.
It would be bad practice to home in on that one print. The lab had to inspect the flashlight for additional prints. The obvious ones and the ones that remained invisible. It required two separate processes. Bloodstains, because they're not oily, can flake or rub off. To fix them in place, the flashlight was heated to 100 degrees Celsius for 10 minutes.
After I heat it on, I then put a stain on there, which is called amido black, which reacts to the blood and makes it very visible, and oftentimes brings up areas of blood that were invisible prior to treatment.
To develop the latent or unseen prints, the flashlight was exposed to superglue vapor. The adhesive bonds to the moisture on the print, creating a durable shell that exposes and preserves it. Then, a fluorescent dye is applied, which adheres to the superglue. The latent prints shine under ultraviolet light. Testing revealed no other blood-stained prints. The original one, along with the latent prints, would have to do. Once a suspect was isolated, investigators were confident that the bloody fingerprint was all they'd need. While the clues were being scrutinized, Melinda McLean and her husband David went to the police station to give their statements. Melinda told police that she'd been best friends with Becky Vargas for 14 years.
Oh, and then we went back.
Becky had been married to her brother, Stephen Vargas, for 9 of them, but it looked like their marriage was coming to an end. As far as she knew, the split was amicable. Though Becky was having an affair that her husband Stephen Vargas may have suspected, there didn't seem to be a lot of tension between the couple. In fact, it was Stephen who had called the McLeans to look in on her, after the police told him they had no officers available to check on his wife. David McLean, down the hall, told police a similar story. He said that Stephen Vargas had called him just before 11 p.m. the night before the murder.
Did Steve at all go over there?
Stephen was worried because she was away so long. The apartment had no lights. He said that he and Melinda stopped by. Though Becky's car was in the driveway, there was no answer. They went to a window to see if everything was okay. Stopped when they heard moaning. They thought that perhaps her boyfriend was there, so they left. They went to a payphone to tell Stephen that everything was fine. They told him what they had heard, then they left. David told police that out of curiosity, they drove back to Becky's a short time later. Now they were surprised to see Stephen Vargas's Jeep parked out front. Soon he appeared from beside the building, got into the vehicle, and drove off. David said that they caught up with him. Stephen was wearing his bathrobe and slippers. He told them he wanted to check on Becky himself, but asked the McLeans not to tell anyone who was there. When David revealed this detail to the police, Melinda reluctantly admitted it was true. police that Stephen called him once more early the following morning. He said that Becky still wasn't home and asked him to check on her again. That's when they found her dead. At autopsy, the medical examiner determined that the lantern found at the scene wasn't the actual murder weapon, but it may have been used to subdue the victim. From the shape of the wound, she was apparently struck down with a hammer or something similar. No such object was located. The killer was clever enough to carry off or remove some of the most incriminating evidence. Authorities hoped he'd left enough behind. At the police station, investigators continued to talk with the McLeans. Their detailed story seemed to pivot on Stephen Vargas. Then it took a more provocative twist when the police dispatcher told Detective David Wheeloff that Vargas was on the phone, but he wasn't calling about his wife.
She said that he was on the phone inquiring about his sister and his brother-in-law, and if they were in fact at the police station. And I told the dispatcher, yeah, that's who we're in here talking to. And if she would ask him if he would mind coming down to the police station as well.
Police told him about Becky's murder and said that his in-laws were fine, but he might not be, because Melinda and David saw him at the murder scene. He admitted that he was there that night, just as the McLeans had said. He peeked in the window, but he heard and saw nothing. Because the window was right next to where the victim was found, Wheeloff didn't believe him.
If Steve had gone there to look and listen, I don't think it would have been likely that he would have not seen Becky lying just a few feet away.
His suspicious behavior and the eyewitness testimony by the McLeans was enough to get a warrant to search Stephen Vargas's Jeep and to collect his fingerprints and a blood sample. Investigators were after anything that could link it to the crime scene. They found nothing but minuscule fragments of leaves, and not even many of those. The Jeep looked recently vacuumed. They collected what they could, then returned the vehicle to Vargas and sent him home. The forensics team hoped they wouldn't need to rely on the leaves. Now that they had Vargas's fingerprint, they could compare it to the ones from the flashlight. Most of the prints did, in fact, match Stephen Vargas. But that made sense. He owned it. So the only one that really mattered was the one stamped in blood. The bloody fingerprint had a shape called a tented arch. Of the three features of fingerprints, loops, arches, and whorls, arches are the least common, and tented arches are rarer still. Only 5% of the population has them. Stephen Vargas was among that group. But the fingerprint on the flashlight wasn't clear enough to make a definitive comparison. Vargas might have left it, and then again, maybe not.
I cannot say he did not leave that print behind. I can only say it's not enough to identify it positively.
They thought the flashlight would illuminate the killer. Without it, their hopes of solving the case looked considerably more dim. Investigators working to solve the Becky Vargas homicide saw their most promising piece of evidence rendered useless. According to Detective Wheeloff, a case that had looked cut and dried now depended on very fragile clues.
After we lost the flashlight, about the last piece of physical evidence we had that we could try and do anything with were the leaf fragments that were recovered out of the Jeep.
If investigators could find specks of blood on the tiny fragments, they would support the idea that Stephen Vargas was close enough to the body to have tracked them into his Jeep. It fell to supervising criminalist Pilar Shortsleeve to analyze the minuscule samples.
Trying to see blood on a small piece of colorful leaf was difficult. We used a stereo zoom so we could get down and look very closely at the leaves, and then to kind of guesstimate if we had any stains, and then we would do some preliminary tests. Well,
out of the 5 samples of leaves, Pilar Shortsleeve found traces of blood on 2, but she had no proof the blood was the victim's. She rushed the samples to a DNA lab for analysis, fearing it might already be too late.
Whenever blood or body fluids are left on soil or samples that contain a lot of possible bacteria, bacteria begin immediately in destroying the sample. They destroy not only the cells, but they get into the DNA and start to break the DNA down.
It would take 3 months for the results to come back from the lab. Investigators had to bide their time, but they didn't do it idly. It had been assumed that the results would be negative, and began to build their case some other way. Police served a warrant to search Vargas's apartment. They were after the bathrobe and slippers he was seen wearing at the crime scene. If he had beaten his wife to death, surely they'd be blood-spattered. Vargas left the clothes in plain sight, easy to find.
I heard that he was supposed to wear a bathrobe and a pair of slippers.
The bathrobe had been freshly laundered. The slippers had no trace of debris on them. That in itself was strange, considering he admitted walking outdoors in them.
It seemed like Stephen Vargas was one step ahead of us on getting rid of any physical evidence that might link him to the crime scene. It seemed like every step that we thought of to locate that evidence was foiled.
Robert?
But there was one clue he couldn't bury, because it was 375 miles away in Cheyenne, Wyoming. After several weeks of wrestling with his conscience, Vargas's half-brother, Robert Esquivel, called police to tell him a favor that Stephen had asked before Becky's murder.
Steve had asked him if he would come out here and kill Becky for him.
Police set up a phone tap in Esquivel's apartment and had him call Vargas to get him to talk about their previous conversation.
Steve had gone through this denying or not remembering that part of their conversation, that it had been a joke, and towards the end even got threatening.
Though it stopped short of a confession, Vargas had said enough for police to arrest him on January 11, 1996, for the murder of Becky Vargas. But they weren't sure they had enough evidence to convict him. 1 month later, the results of the DNA test on the blood-spattered leaves found in Stephen Vargas's Jeep came through. A comparison of the DNA from the blood on the leaves matched Becky Vargas's DNA.
The blood on the blood fragments matched Rebecca Vargas.
Now authorities were confident of a conviction.
Where are you going?
Based on the evidence, police put together a likely scenario. Stephen Vargas, angry with his wife over infidelity and their upcoming divorce, confronted her in her new apartment. They fought. It escalated. And he hit her with a flashlight, knocking her out. He moved her to the side of the house, thinking she was dead. He was wrong. He wanted someone else to find the body, so he asked the McLeans to check up on her. They mistook her death throes for the throes of passion. When they told Stephen, he returned to finish what he'd begun, using a more lethal weapon. Tiny fragments of leaves told the whole story.
Well, in this case in particular, we had this flashlight that had a possible fingerprint in it, in blood. And that would have been the piece of evidence that kind of closed all the loose ends, but it didn't happen. In this case, it was a very small piece of leaf that was found in a vehicle that had blood on it that came from the victim. And it was just the interesting and exciting part that something so small could be so integral in a case.
Stephen Vargas was convicted of first-degree murder and is now serving 20 years to life. The case of Becky Vargas began with the discovery of her body. But when a person just disappears, it's not clear that a crime has even been committed. In this story, the names of the victim and the killer have been changed. On the morning of July 31st, 1987, Dan Remington of San Diego, California, was taking his kids to the YMCA.
Okay.
En route, he noticed his wife's abandoned car on the side of the road.
Okay.
Not wanting to alarm his children, he dropped them off at daycare and rushed home to call the police. The San Diego police dispatched an officer. On his way to Remington's house, he stopped to examine the vehicle. The car apparently had a flat tire. The doors were locked, and he could see no spare, nor any sign of 29-year-old Liz Remington. When the officer arrived at the Remington's home, Dan Remington told him that he last saw his wife at 10:30 the previous night when she left for work. After he saw her car at 7:30, he called the hospital where she was a maternity nurse, but she hadn't shown up. Remington admitted that their 12-year marriage was rocky. They were discussing divorce, but hadn't filed the papers yet.
Wonder why that Excel sheet's not coming up.
Dan handed the officer a key to the car and granted
Wednesday,
permission to
could be
impound it in search of clues. While it was possible that Liz's disappearance could be logically explained, missing persons cases fell under the domain of the homicide unit. They had the skills to collect and preserve every piece of potential evidence found at the scene. They found nothing obvious to indicate foul play. They towed the car to the police garage. Any overlooked clues would be preserved in case the car required a closer look. Detectives visited a nearby convenience store, thinking that Liz might have gone there after her tire went flat. The clerk told them that she had been in the night before. She needed to break a $20 bill to make a phone call. He didn't know who she called. Police remembered that Dan Remington told them she hadn't called home with the bill change. It seemed reasonable to believe she may have simply run off with someone else. Liz's sister told police that was inconceivable. She wasn't the kind of woman who would run from a failing marriage. No matter how bad things became, she'd never leave her children. Sergeant Dennis Brugos of the San Diego Metro Task Force found that was the consensus.
She was very devoted to her children and her family. She helped at school, she helped at Little League, and just not the type of woman that would ever walk away from her family.
Liz's sister told police it was strange that the spare tire was missing. Dan had changed the oil 2 weeks earlier and made a point of thoroughly checking the car, including the spare. Investigators took statements from the Remingtons' neighbors. Many spoke of the deteriorating relationship between Liz and Dan. The information was duly noted, but in terms of evidence that any crime had been committed, investigators had absolutely nothing. At the time of Liz Remington's disappearance, San Diego police were grappling with an apparent serial killer. Because there was no evidence that Remington had left against her will, these more violent crimes took priority.
There was no body, there was no weapon, and therefore she was simply one of many missing adults throughout this county. And at that particular time, there was actually a series of sorts that was going on where there was upwards of 40 women who were found murdered in the East County area. So certainly that would have precedent over a missing person.
4 years passed since Liz Remington's disappearance. Most of the murdered women were transients or prostitutes, so she was not considered one of the killer's victims. But when a task force was formed to look into the serial killings, her file came up too. Investigators realized she was still missing after all this time. The neighbors taped statements. The detective reports were dusted off. Well before Liz's disappearance, they had kept a close eye on the Remingtons and helped Liz out whenever they could. Over time, friction between the couple increased, and neighbors grew concerned about her and the children. One even kept a log of what went on at the house after Liz disappeared. To demonstrate how the Remingtons' relationship had deteriorated, a neighbor told investigators about how Dan tried to sell Liz's car without her permission. According to the neighbor, Liz wasn't just surprised, she was furious. A huge fight ensued. He said that the only reason Dan didn't sell the vehicle was because Liz had the only key and wouldn't give it to him. But police recalled that on the day Liz disappeared, Dan had the key to her vehicle in his possession. Police also learned that neighbors had reported seeing Dan Remington filling in a ravine at the back of his property with a bulldozer shortly after Liz's disappearance. They said that after her disappearance, they saw him visit that part of the property every few days. He never ventured back there before she disappeared.
Peanut-sized head.
Remarkably, because the case had never been officially closed, Liz's car had remained impounded all this time.
Okay. See, you listen to me.
Dan
Why
was
are you
soon to get
so
released,
mean?
but lost. Technically, it was still considered evidence.
I wish somebody would do that for me right here.
Now it would be looked at more thoroughly. One of the first things investigators found were coins in the ashtray. Reportedly,
Let me get my coffee, okay?
convenience store when she wanted change to make a phone call. Clerk's statement suggested she was okay. Now investigators weren't so certain, so she had ample change in her car. They contacted the clerk to interview him again.
That clerk at the convenience store actually said he wasn't real sure that it was her. So that helped us to establish the fact that we didn't really know for sure whether she was there.
Suspicions of foul play had been aroused. Rugos wondered if the flat tire could have been staged. He He sent the flattened tire from Liz's car to Goodyear Tire and Rubber in Akron, Ohio. The lab is designed to evaluate the causes of tire.
I'm entitled to my space. Okay? Sit. If you want to stay.
Sure.
Just
The
look
tire
cute.
was examined on the rim.
The report was the tire was flat, still flat.
Investigators found
Oh,
no obvious
no,
signs of
seriously.
damage,
Sit down and stop it.
only a tiny puncture, which would have led to slow deflation.
You can't get up on that, Eddie. Excuse me. Let me do something. I have to do something.
Took the tire off its mouth
Eddie,
and examined it more thoroughly. From the looks of it,
Eddie.
the tire went flat after the car had stopped.
We saw no damage on its tire. We saw no reason to have alerted any driver in the vehicle that something was going soft or whether the tire was deflating. Because in order to do that, the tire is beginning to come apart, and you would see that damage on the tire itself, and we saw no such damage.
But he did see something he'd never seen in his 35 years' experience. The tire removed from Liz Remington's car had been punctured from the inside out.
The tire had been punctured from the inside. See these two impressions, circular impressions, right under the punctures of the tire. We noticed the rust that's contained in them. It told me that somebody had taken a nail and pounded it through the inside of the tire to cause that circular nail-head impressions on the liner itself.
He concluded that the tire had definitely been tampered with. 4 years after Liz Remington's disappearance, investigators had enough to get a warrant to search Dan Remington's house. They found nothing of significance inside. Outside was a different story. In the yard, police backhoe went to work excavating the filled-in ravine.
The backhoe was probably 2 or 3 hours into the job when it hooked onto a piece of chain link fence that was lying flat. The excavation slowed down. What we found underneath that chain link fence was a tire.
The tire was the missing tire from Liz's car, and underneath that tire, wrapped in sheets and blankets, was the body of a female. And the missing persons investigation became a murder case. Dan Remington was arrested and taken away. Officially, the body was considered a Jane Doe until a positive ID could be made. A forensic anthropologist determined the remains were those of a Caucasian female who had died of blunt trauma to the head. She had been in her late 20s to early 30s, about the same height as Liz Remington. It seemed like they had found what they were looking for, but the law required more proof than that. Forensic dentist Norman Sperber was called in.
Everything hinged on the teeth. Teeth are the most durable part of the body, and we fortunately had dental films from her dentist. We were able to take films of her teeth because they were in very good condition.
By comparing the shape and position of the victim's fillings and teeth with Liz Remington's dental records, Sperber was able to make a positive ID. Liz Remington had been found. Because the victim was discovered wrapped in bed linens, investigators believe that Dan killed her while she was napping before work. Afterward, he carried the body out to the ravine, buried it in a shallow grave, then rented the earth-moving equipment a short time later, piling on 8 to 12 feet of dirt. Then he drove to the scene and replaced the good tire with the one he had flattened. Next morning, he reported his wife missing, confident the police would never piece it together. His unwitting accomplice was a suspected serial killer who demanded all of the police department's resources.
My
But the clues eventually resurfaced, exposing the crime.
Yes, my
Though Remington's exact motive will never be known, authorities believe he couldn't bear the shame of divorce, or the fact that he'd lose half of his wealth and property. In October 1992, Dan Remington was found guilty of the first-degree murder of his wife. He was sentenced to life without parole. Remington went to a great deal of trouble to hide his crime. Others take an easier approach, which sometimes makes their crimes harder to solve. On September 21st, 1995, a body was discovered in a wooded area in Boise, Idaho. Plastic bags bound with duct tape encased the feet and head. From its state of decay, it had obviously been there several days. No ID was found. No attempt had been made to conceal the body. It appeared to have been hurriedly dumped there. Because of its position and wrappings, investigators couldn't even determine the victim's gender without disturbing an already disturbing scene. At this point, anything could be a clue, so the body wasn't unwrapped or inspected until it got to the morgue, where it was scrutinized under controlled conditions. The tape was carefully cut away, and the bags removed and preserved. The victim was female, around 60 years old. The coroner determined that she was strangled. She was most likely killed elsewhere, wrapped up, and transported to the woods where she was found. She fit the description of Wanda Kuzmicek, reported missing 6 days earlier. Wanda had been reported missing by her second husband, Ben Kuzmicek, when she failed to return from work. The couple had been married just 4 months. Both had retired from the large firm they worked for. Wanda took a job cleaning offices. You are beautiful. Ben, a Russian immigrant who had once been artistic director for the Idaho Ballet, now worked for a security company. After Ben reported her missing, detectives wondered if Wanda had had second thoughts about her second marriage and simply run off. But a check of her jewelry and possessions showed she'd taken nothing with her. That's never a good sign. And then her body turned up. The victim's car had not been found, so the bags she was wrapped in became the most important clue. Criminalist Cynthia Hill set to work examining them. It was all she had.
Well, in this case, we didn't have a murder weapon. There were no eyewitnesses. And the place where Wanda was found was not the murder scene. So all these things were playing against us.
Hill beat the bags in super glue to bring out any fingerprints. The glue, contained in foil pouches, vaporizes and bonds to the print, preserving it. The print can then be dusted with powder to make it more visible. Then photographed to create a record. Hill found only one print on the bag around the victim's legs, but so far she had no one to compare it with. Ben Kuzmichev was called to the police station to provide a set of prints for comparison. In a murder investigation, it's standard procedure to get a spouse's prints. Usually, it eliminates the spouse as a suspect. In this case, that isn't quite how it worked out. The print on the bag matched Ben's. That didn't necessarily mean he had a hand in his wife's murder. If the bag had been taken from the victim's own car, Ben might have handled it prior to its use in the crime. The print was lifted from a portion of the bag where one would normally grab it. In terms of evidence, it wasn't enough.
These people are living together. They're touching objects that one another touch. You have to be able to find a fingerprint in a location where they wouldn't normally have touched, or it's in conjunction with another piece of evidence that puts them at the scene.
Hill still believed that the bags might contain more prints. Though she didn't have the technology to lift them, she knew that the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Crime Lab did. If prints were there, the Mounties could find them, or so she hoped. She carefully packed her bags, sent them to Canada, and awaited the results. While Cynthia Hill waited for her prints to come from Canada, investigators in Idaho found Wanda Kuzmichev's car. More than a week had passed since her body was discovered. The vehicle had been abandoned in a store parking lot 4 miles from where she was found. Police processed the vehicle for fingerprints. They raised 2 prints from the trunk lid. Their placement suggested they were left by the person closing the trunk. Inside, investigators found something surprising. Nothing at all. For Detective David Smith of the Boise, Idaho Police Department, that was a significant discovery.
In talking with family members, they said that she would always carry her Jehovah's Witness literature in the trunk. In fact, they said you could not put anything in her trunk because it was so full.
But the trunk wasn't entirely empty. Investigators found a single drop of blood. It belonged to the victim. Whoever had put her in the trunk had also left fingerprints on the gearshift knob. Prints on the trunk and on the gearshift matched Ben Kuzmichev. Investigators faced the same challenges as before. The car belonged to Ben's wife. It stood to reason that he could leave his fingerprints on it. Still, it seemed strange that his were the only clear prints found, especially since he told police that as far as he knew, Wanda was the last person to drive the vehicle. The evidence suggested that Ben drove it last, leaving behind the clearest prints.
Tests were conducted to show that in approximately 70% of all cases, the last person who drives the car and activates the gearshift lever will destroy the person's prints who drove the car prior to and leave their prints on the gearshift lever.
The prints made detectives 70% sure that Ben Kuzmichev was lying. That wasn't good enough. The inspection of the car seat disclosed another clue.
I wore the stature in she was 5'4" and 140 pounds. When I looked at the seat, it appeared to be back farther than usual for a woman of that stature to be driving the vehicle. So I placed a female of 5'4", 140 pounds inside the vehicle. She was unable to reach the pedals, which appeared to be a comfortable driving position. Conversely, I put a male matching Ben's description, 5'11", 190 pounds, into the driver's seat, and they fit very comfortable.
I'm more in my
The experiment
thinking.
provided more circumstantial proof that Ben was alive. But it still didn't prove he was a murderer. By now, the Canadian Royal Mounted Police Lab had performed their tests on the trash bag used to wrap the body of Wanda Kuzmichev. The test, called vacuum metal deposition, is a state-of-the-art method for lifting difficult prints from plastic. The bag is placed in a vacuum chamber, then pelted with ions of gold, which cling to the plastic, but not to the oily prints. Then it's exposed to ionized zinc, which clings only to the gold, leaving the prints untouched and in contrast against the plastic. The process revealed a second print on the bag. According to Cynthia Hill, the position of this print was far more incriminating.
The second fingerprint that was developed using the vacuum metal deposition proved that he had a direct contact with that bag because the positioning of the hand was in such a way that he would be grabbing the plastic bag, wrapping the tape around Wanda, and
the position
he would be the only one that would be
print.
leaving the fingerprint in that position at that time.
Yeah. In most cases, that would be enough to win a conviction. But investigators weren't so sure. Proving a spousal murder on fingerprints alone would be a hard sell. The prints and other evidence they gathered gave them enough to get a search warrant for the Kuzmichevs' home.
Be back.
They found no signs that this was the murder scene. But they did find the Jehovah's Witness literature that the victim's family said she never removed from her car. The items presented more circumstantial evidence that Ben had been involved in the murder. By January 1996, 4 months after the crime, investigators were still building their case against Ben Kuzmichev. He began to feel the circle of evidence closing in on him, and he announced he was going back to Russia. At that point, police had no choice but to charge him with Wanda's murder. If he returned to Russia, he'd be a free man, beyond U.S. extradition. Though they had enough to arrest him, they weren't certain they had a solid case for murder from the first. Between the time of his arrest and the trial date, investigators continued to gather evidence against Kuzmichev. Under surveillance in jail, he couldn't make a move without authorities knowing about it.
We placed monitoring devices on approximately 17 phones inside the jail at the Ada County Jail. That gave us the ability to monitor his conversations as outgoing as well as whoever he was seeing as a visitor. The end result was that we received nothing that could be used in court. Nothing incriminating came about the phone calls.
But help came from an unlikely source. Kuzmichev had confided details of his crime to his cellmate.
I'll wait through that.
The details to authorities.
Oh, okay. How dumb could you be?
He had nothing to gain by doing so.
But I just saw watching TV one evening when the news media broadcast that we located a witness who had told us that she had, in fact, sold Ben duct tape and trash bags. The inmate told us that Ben found this humorous that he had, in fact, purchased from this lady, but they were not the ones that we were looking for that he used in the crime.
The inmate's information, though hearsay, provided one more strike against Ben Kuzmichev. Investigators realized they'd gathered all they were going to get. They weren't sure they had enough. But because Ben was likely to be released and flee to Russia, they had to take the case to trial. From what police could put together, 4 months after their marriage, Ben and Wanda's honeymoon was over. He had been dependent on her money, but wanted to return to his homeland. She refused to go. Their animosity built, and Ben strangled her. He wrapped her body in plastic bags, emptied the trunk of her car, loaded her in, and dumped her in the woods. Then he abandoned the car in the parking lot. Based on the accumulated evidence, Ben Kuzmichev was convicted of the second-degree murder of his wife, Wanda. and sentenced to 21 years to life. For Detective David Smith, solving this case meant more than simply delivering justice.
You do become personally involved. I mean, this guy has come into your town, committed this heinous act, and now you have this grieving family that you want to do everything in your power to solve this case for. And that's how I personally take it, and I know any other seasoned homicide detective will tell you the same thing.
When spouse kills spouse, the clues are sometimes difficult to read, but the marriage of forensic science and good detective work can bring together